So it's a very warm welcome this morning from me, Gideon Amos. I'm a former inspector who dealt with nationally significant infrastructure projects at the Planning Inspectorate. And I've also chaired the annual Waterfront NSIPs Forum conference, which happens in March each year, certainly be March next year. So this is a really important and key time. We're facing a much bigger slew of nationally significant infrastructure projects coming through the system. There's a lot of emphasis from government on infrastructure development, and we have a new consultation launched now by government on speeding up the NSIP process. So this is a really timely event being put on by Waterfront, and I hope you get the most you can out of it. We have 4 speakers. We have 2 speakers from the department, which is now called the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, who will be speaking first about the consultation that's now live. And then we have Julian Boswell from Burgess Salmon, and we also have Anna Sutherland-Bamber, DCO and Planning Manager from Lower Thames Crossing with Jacobs. So we have a really good panel of speakers to talk to you today about the consultation, about speeding up the NSIP process, and about the regime in general, and how perhaps all of us can bring our experience to bear of that process on how we can improve the regime and improve the speed of the regime. So I'm going to now move to invite Tom Carpen. Tom is NSIP delivery lead at the department. As I know, he was in it at the beginning when the regime was set up by the Planning Act 2008, which I first came across as a planning white paper and then a bill. And Tom was involved in those early days, setting up the new regime and dealing with some of the very first DCO projects and DCOs to be made. And he's now with the department responsible for, involved with the new consultation on speeding up the NSIP process. And he's joined and supported by Leo Cunningham-Bailey, who's Senior Technical Planning Officer at the department. And he has spent around a decade working in the private sector and is now has now recently joined the department and is working also on this consultation. So without further ado, if I can hand over to you, Tom, and we're really delighted to have you with us this morning and to hear, direct from you about the new consultation.
Gideon, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you to Waterfront for inviting us to set some context for the webinar. It is a really exciting time, and we've got just a few slides to kind of share and just sort of help with some of the background here. Hopefully most of you have heard about Project Speed, which is the government's programme across infrastructure of all types and sort of end-to-end in terms of speeding up infrastructure delivery. And I just wanted to sort of start with that because the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects Reform Programme, a good mouthful there, is part of Project Speed, and it's the NSIP part of it. And back in November last year, the National Infrastructure Strategy was launched, and in that we set out the ambition for NSIP reform and 3 aspects in particular. But I just wanted to pause and say that we recognise the strength of the regime over the last 12 years or so and the infrastructure consents that it has delivered. So we have a strong starting point for this reform programme, but also we have a sort of a stronger future context as well. Not only do we have the pipeline that Gideon mentioned, but also the the significant challenges external to sort of the projects that go in around, for example, climate change and levelling up. So we're looking ahead as much as we are learning from where we've come from. So this is an ambitious reform programme in many respects, because it needs to be. And so the headline, I think, in that is the ambition to cut timescales by up to 50% for some projects entering the system from September 2023. And I just for clarification, I think from our point of view, that includes pre-application as well as post-application up to decision. So we're looking at that sort of period when the projects come to the planning inspectorate, sort of as intended DCO applications. So it's not just the examination side of things. I think also one of the key ambitions was to establish sort of acceleration of existing projects. And I think the thinking behind that is very much that we're not just waiting till September 2023 to see sort of improvements to the regime with some ambition. I think we're looking at how we can actually tackle challenges with projects now and look at innovative ways of doing that. And I'll come on to that particular aspect in the next slide. But the final sort of area of ambition set out in the National Infrastructure Strategy was around national policy statements, sort of a recognition that they really are the cornerstone of the process, if you like. And so since the National Infrastructure Strategy, we've been doing a huge amount of work and across government as well. So this is a cross-government programme led by Ministerial Board with Minister Chris Pincher and Lord Agnew. And we are so breaking this down in terms of delivery in three broad areas. The first of those, which is the focus of today, is what we're calling operational review with project acceleration. And I'll come on to that in the next slide as well. But just to add that the other two sort of main areas of work are on NSIP reform are national policy statements and the coordination of those, and hopefully you can sort of see some of the effects of that work already. And separately and linked to the wider planning reform is the reform of the environmental impact assessment process in particular, and insofar as it relates to the NSIP process. So if I could have the next slide, please, Maxine. Thank you. So for today's webinar, and I think I just really want to emphasize how important, so we feel that insights from people who use the process, whatever position you have in the process, and people who infrastructure projects affect or sort of relate to, particularly in local communities, is really important to us understanding how we can improve this process. So we're undertaking an end-to-end review of how the process works. But by that, it's not just sort of unpicking, you know, the bits of the act and sort of making improvements here and there. I think we can see from our sort of experience, everyone's experience of projects, that the issues that play out in examination and decisions have root causes or root sort of issues that might not sit within the process itself. They might sit outside, be that from the investment stage, the planning stage. There might be challenges in implementation that are sort of stem from the actual sort of development of the project. So this is really to understand what causes the challenges for projects to go through the system smoothly, and where they might sit and who they might relate to. So this is why it's cross-government, and this is why we're also trying to work with users across, you know, whatever interest they have in the process. And so we're doing this in 4 phases up to September 2023, with phase 1 being this current sort of engagement, if you like, focusing on gathering evidence and gathering data. And that's why we're going up to the end of 2021 to take the time to speak to people, to really build the conversation and understanding and get that user experience. But we're also doing a whole range of other sort of research work, investigative work, both within government and externally as well, to build that evidence base to take us into the next phase. And I think at the bottom then, just to really emphasize that we want to hear lessons, we want to hear ideas, but we really want the evidence for that, and we want to understand your insights. And we are ambitious. We recognize that 50% ambition is challenging in its own right, but actually some of the, if you take particular sectors, and there's a nice shot of an offshore wind farm there, you know, some of the challenges there can't be sort of addressed just by some changes to legislation. They really do need to look at the system as a whole. So we are taking that kind of system-wide view, and we're engaging probably way beyond sort of the core sort of users of the system as well. So this is a really good opportunity, I think, to sort of have a really good look at how infrastructure planning happens, and how we can use the NSIP process to both accelerate delivery, but do so in a way that ensures a robust and quality process as well. So that's from me, just covering the context. I'm going to pass on to Leo now, who's going to talk about how you can sort of be more involved in the engagement process.
Thanks very much, Tom. If we could move to the final slide, that would be great. Thanks very much. So
just as you're handing over there, if I can encourage everyone listening to please put your questions in the Q&A. I see one from Will Spencer already. Please keep tapping your questions in there. And when we've heard from all the speakers, who are roughly 10 minutes each, then we will go through all your questions and invite more from you. Okay, thanks, Leo. Please carry on.
Thanks very much. Just drawing on what Tom said around the operational review. So we're undertaking at the moment an initial evidence gathering survey, and the questions for which are on screen now. We're incredibly thankful for everyone who's already shared their thoughts on this. And we're trying to embody the principles of Project Speed as we go through this. So really looking at sort of in a live fashion, reviewing the information that comes in, reflecting on it, and allowing that to inform our operational review as we pass through it, rather than waiting to the end to look at everything. We're, as Tom said, really keen to listen to everyone who interacts in the NSIP process. I think everyone who has, from consultancy to communities, will have thoughts and reflections on it. And that's really what we're trying to get out of this survey, to really understand from the people who interact with it, what they've learned, what they think could be done better. So I think in particular, the areas we really want to draw out your thoughts on, and I would encourage everyone on this call to do that. Firstly, what has worked for the regime? I think it's fair to say, and this is drawing from my previous life in consultancy, that there's a lot that works there. It was held in pretty high regard, but that's not to say there aren't really significant improvements to be had. But I think through this reform programme, government's really keen to ensure that what does work is sort of kept and improved, and we don't lose what sort of already is beneficial in the scheme in the process. I think a second point we really want to draw out people's thoughts on is what's missing, what doesn't it do so well, what could be improved there. And I think finally, what's causing the difficulties and blockages, where are the pinch points and the bottlenecks that we really need to be paying the most attention to. And of course, if anyone on this call has had time to reflect on these issues and think about what potential solutions might be deployed, we'd be really keen to hear those as well as part of this survey. It's done on an MS Forms, it's online, it shouldn't be onerous to fill out. And as I say, it's an initial evidence gathering survey, and there will be a consultation, I think, next year. But we're really keen to sort of get under the skin of some of these issues and surface them with everyone on this call, sort of working together, using everyone's experience of the regime to really get a holistic 360 view of how it works and where we can really be focusing our time to improve it. So it should hopefully be a really tangible way for you to sort of take your reflections, pass them to us, and allow us to sort of really run with them and look at them further and get under the skin of some of these issues. So just one last plea for you to fill this out. It's really important to us, and we really do want to hear from you. And I think with that brings us to the end of our slot, and I'll pass to the other speakers. But thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Leo. Thanks, Leo. Just one quick one before we do move on to Julian. Just one question's come up. Can you say something about the parallel NPS consultation and the sort of, how, I think it's just worth people knowing that there's NPS reviews ongoing, and specific question here about national networks. I don't know whether Tom or Leo want to say that.
I'm happy to say that, Gideon. I mean, I can't comment on the specific NPSs, and I think just to highlight that this reform programme is recognising just how important they are to the process, and therefore the coordination with the relevant departments is something that's happening, so that consultations can happen, and again, when they do happen, encouraging people to really be involved in them in the same way that they are here. I think that's the emphasis from us.
And sorry, another, again, a rather technical one. Someone wants to send their response to the consultation by email rather than MS Forms. Is that possible?
Yeah, I probably
come back to us on that. Yes, okay, yeah. That's nice and clear. Great. Okay, well, let's move on to and we will go back to the the questions are beginning to come in now. So please continue to share them with us in the Q&A, and I've got a log of them all here, and we will be coming back to all of you who've asked questions when we have the speakers. I'd like to introduce Julian Boswell now, who is a partner at Burgess Salmon. Julian has a huge amount of experience, having led on a whole range of NSIP applications, over 30 since the beginning of the regime, and he's a board member of the National Infrastructure Planning Association and one of the leading lawyers in the field. So we're really pleased to have you with us, Julian. Over to you.
Thank you, Gideon. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to broadly speak under three sort of headings. First is some contextual remarks that I think are relevant to achieving speed. The next is to make a specific proposal in relation to one category of NSIPs, just to say something more specific rather than just make general remarks, and then to finish up with a few general remarks. But of course, one can't do justice to this topic in 10 minutes. So the starting point is to, in terms of context from my perspective, is to recognise that we are dealing by definition with the most complex projects. Nationally significant infrastructure projects are necessarily the most complex, and therefore there is inevitably a balance between getting things right and the speed of the process. And with complexity, there is a lot to get right. So I do think we need to bear that in mind, and anybody that's
I don't know if we've lost Julian. Okay, I'm seeing a message that we've lost Julian there for the moment. What I'm going to do is go straight to Anna, and then we'll come back to Julian a bit later, and hopefully his connection will have refreshed by then. Okay, is that okay, Anna, if we bring you in? And I'll introduce you now. You're DCO and Planning Manager, Lower Thames Crossing, and you've been with Jacobs in that role, Associate Director there. You're a Chartered Town Planner, Environmental Consultant, over 10 years experience in infrastructure projects, and your MSc is in sustainability. And I think it's really important actually that we have that EIA environmental input here, because it's such a huge part of the NSIP regime, isn't it? So over to you. You're very welcome. Thank you very much,
Gideon, and thank you to Tom and Leo for the setting out the context, and hopefully Julian will be able to come back shortly. I think my kind of first remarks in starting is that if you look at infrastructure, natural infrastructure, I think by its very definition it is long term, and we should all see ourselves working in this industry as sustainability professionals. The decisions we make today will impact on both the natural environment and the communities that that infrastructure is set in, as well as a more regional and global growth for decades to come. So we need to have that kind of moral responsibility that although speeding up infrastructure will help us beat those short-term gains where there's a clear problem statement that needs to be resolved, in 10, 20, 30, 40, even 100 years time, you know, the infrastructure and the decisions we make today as a group of professionals will still have a lasting impact. And with that, and I'm not sure if someone could put my slide up, please. I think when looking at how do we speed up the NSIP process, and looking at the kind of the four key concepts that came out of Boris's speech in June last year, faster was one of the aspects. And I don't think we'll actually be able to achieve the faster element unless we look at it in the round with the better, bolder and greener. And I think the challenges that we may find in better, bolder and greener could be some of the blockers to achieving faster NSIPs. If we look at better and how that may manifest itself in the NSIPs and the projects that are coming through the system, I think there's better means very different things to different people. And there is obviously a school of thought that you know, in some cases infrastructure is bad, infrastructure will impact on the environment. You know, there are a number of both temporary and operational effects of it, likewise on the communities that it's in. And sometimes a do nothing scenario may be the best solution at all. And I know that's a difficult conversation for a lot of us to have, and not one that necessarily sits right with lots of us in the profession, but I think we really do need to ask these difficult questions very early on in the schemes to make sure that the right projects are coming through to really hit the kind of the problem areas within the infrastructure of our country. If we look at bolder, I think bolder means again, different things. I think it's seeking for us to be much more aspirational in the infrastructure that we build. Again, it's ensuring we're leaving a lasting legacy in what's been achieved. I also see bolder and looking at it, the practicalities of the implications of the regime. One of the core debates within the national infrastructure regime, and for any of you that have worked in it, is that detail versus flexibility agenda, and how much information do we front load in our applications versus the level of detail which may come later on when we've got contractors on board. I think looking at bolder, we need to look, and some of the solutions we could use to do this is leveraging data, digital data. There's a huge amount of data out there, and I'm by no means a professional in this area. It kind of scares me and daunts me in a personal way. But I think if you look at where we have multiple infrastructure projects being brought together at the same time in the same geographical location, I think there's a lot more collaboration that can be done with that data to make sure that we are providing a kind of regional strategy for infrastructure, and not just looking at the type of infrastructure in the area that it comes back into. I also think in bolder, and it is a growing area in the industry, we'll need to take a much more look at really looking to implement post-consent management and adaptive management strategies. It's trusting us as an industry, working with our stakeholders, that there's a level of information that we just need to be adaptive to. We may not know everything now. If you look at these projects and the development of them, a lot of these kind of have 5, 6, 7 year plus construction schedules, and the environment of which we sit in changes. We need to make sure we can adapt to that process. In terms of greener, I think there's a huge amount of really good work that's going on at the moment. We've got the net zero by 2050 challenge and the biodiversity net gain. I think it will be a challenge. It's a good upward step of the legacy of our projects to be undertaken. But that says, we're all waiting for some of these kind of targets and aspirations to come out, and how we then apply those to our projects. And I think again, one of the challenges is it's a very evolving framework that we're sat in, and it's trying to make sure that we can take all the good stuff that's coming out, looking at the aspirational aspects of us as a country, and that we as individuals want to deliver into our projects. But also against the challenge of we have quite strict regimes, quite clear assessment methodologies which we need to follow that will feed into our DCO applications. As Gideon mentions, the environmental impact assessment is a core component of a DCO application. In general cases, it's about 50% of the entire application. It shows such an importance of how we bring that together. But likewise, we talk about within the environmental impact assessment world, how can we streamline environmental assessments? How can we make them more kind of proportionate and concise to the work that we're doing? We all know environmental impact assessments get bigger, and how does that conflict against trying to go faster if we're constantly providing more data, bigger reports, etc., that then take time to be read and processed? In terms of faster, I think if you look at the regime itself, there are set timescales. You've got your 1 month acceptance, you've got your 6 months examination. I don't think there's anywhere in the regime that says you can't actually deliver in shorter timescales. And I think it's taken a while for us as a country and the industry and our stakeholders, particularly those who don't work in the industry, the stakeholders, the communities, the local authorities, of which it's the first NSIP on their doorstep, to understand what this process is. And I think change for change's sake doesn't always make things faster. So I think we need to look at the framework which is there, and how those improvements can be made onto it going forwards. With that, I think, and I can see Julian's come back online, so I will leave you there.
Anna.
I think my final words, I think it's very exciting times for us in the industry, and I know that in talking to many of my peers, one that we're really looking forward to kind of see how this evolves going forwards, and the great work coming out from the department.
Thank you, Anna. And I think, some really good challenges there about no change for change's sake. It makes a lot of sense. Julian has seamlessly rejoined us, and we lost you just after you had been talking, Julian, about the complexity of the regime and you know, not to be understated, and the link obviously with the complexity of the projects to the timescale. So please feel free to pick up, and everything's gone smoothly in your absence. So we're delighted to see you back online.
Great, thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. My internet went down unexpectedly. So I was talking about the complexity. The next point is fairness. This has to be fair. It's a public process, and therefore I know the Planning Inspectorate have always been very mindful of this, and I think that that's an overriding factor that we have to bear in mind, not least because, of course, there are plenty of communities that will only ever or have only seen one NSIP, may only see one NSIP over a very long period of time, and therefore having to bear in mind those communities getting to grips with that as a process that's very different to the planning process is important. Then, of course, we have, while some technical stakeholders are dealing with lots of NSIPs and have dedicated teams, that puts them in a special category in a good way, but even they often have resourcing issues, as we know, and I know that's one of the things that Project Speed is looking at. And then, but of course, there are other technical stakeholders, typically local authorities, that may only get one NSIP every 10 years or whatever, who again are learning from scratch. So I think that sets some contextual points around getting this right in terms of striking the balance between speeding things up and recognizing the realities. If you stand back and look at the last 10 years, I think it's fair to say that there are, the way I look at it is that there are three categories of NSIP. You've got the mega projects, which are the nuclear power stations and the Heathrows, of whom there are very few, and they really are in a very different category, I think, with the different demands and complexities and resourcing issues and timing issues. So you've got those at one end, then you've got the smaller, more uncontroversial projects at the other end, where arguably the NSIP regime is disproportionate to what is needed to decide those applications, but where there isn't an easy way to take them out of the regime. And I think more recently, solar schemes, including a couple that we're advising on at the moment, I think fall into that category. There are gas schemes, including one we did 3 or 4 years ago, where it was a gas scheme inside an existing huge paper mill in Kent, replacing an existing redundant or something that was close to its end of life. We literally had no one at the hearings, apart from a couple of random people that no one could persuade to come up and speak on any basis. So you've got those at the other end of the scheme, and then you've got the rest in the middle, which obviously range quite a bit with perhaps offshore wind and large grid and pipelines at the top end of that range. So I think it's obvious to say that the quickest win potentially, and this is where I'm just going to sketch out a proposal just to as a straw man or straw woman, is at the smaller uncontroversial end of that spectrum, where I think a lot could be done without any legislative change. And I'm just going to briefly outline what an approach might be. That you could have published criteria for a so-called fast track NSIP, which would then, of course, have to be honestly applied. The applicant would make a case for fast track status. That would involve explaining why it was clear that there were a limited number of issues, why it was clear that there was limited public interest, potentially other criteria as well. The applicant would then be making a commitment to do certain things to assist fast track status in terms of advanced statements of common ground, for example, and other things. And then in return, what the Planning Inspectorate would give in return, though it would have to be on a non-binding basis so that its discretion was not removed if there were reasons why it needed to change things, or it became apparent that the claims that the applicant had made didn't really stack up or something intervened. The kind of commitment that you might get in return would be, firstly, that you were getting a single inspector, secondly, that you had accelerated pre-examination with that inspector known sufficiently far in advance to be allocated, so that as long as the applicant delivered on a commitment to submit by a particular time, that in return they would know they were getting a pre-inquiry meeting on a particular date that was 2 months rather than typically 3 or 4 months. Crucially, that you were only going to get one set of questions within the examination, because that is the big difference between running to 4 and a bit months if you get one set of questions, or the full 6 months if you get 2, and potentially a commitment that there would only be, that the inspector was aiming for a 2-month recommendation period rather than taking the full 3, which is what normally happens even on the smaller, less demanding schemes. So that is to me the kind of model that could be applied now to ensure that there was more of a multi-track system, because at the moment most projects do seem to fall into something fairly similar. I know there were some variations around how when questions are asked, when hearings are held, and so on, but the vast majority of projects do take the full 6 months or close to the full 6 months. And I think there is the potential right now to have a fast track model, as long as it's operated honestly, I think is a key term in terms of being realistic about what's really happening, and that inspectors don't sort of get into that model without deserving to. Then just a final few much more general remarks on issues. I've already mentioned resourcing of key technical stakeholders. I think there's also a sort of a policy dimension to that. I do a lot in offshore wind, and it does seem that some issues have been knocking around for an awfully long time, where one would have thought that certain things could have been resolved so that there was a much more consistent approach to things, and we weren't thrashing out the same old things in terms of some aspects of data, some aspects of methodology, and so on. And I do think there is some scope there. I know that Natural England are running a process at the moment of pulling together some new guidance, which hopefully will help in that respect. But I think there are quite a lot of winds knocking around in that space. I think there's a whole challenge around training for people that are coming to the DCO process for the first time, whether in the public sector or the private sector, that I think is in the mix. Just going back again to offshore wind, and Gideon alluded to this a little while ago, that there is a very particular issue at the moment in offshore wind, whereby because projects have either hit or are close to the sort of environmental headroom in terms of the habitats regime, there is now an expectation that BEIS has laid down that projects put forward so-called without prejudice derogation cases, and that brings quite a lot of challenges in terms of timing as to whether it's reasonable to be expected to have a fully developed derogation case with compensatory measures when it's not certain that you're actually going to lose the argument and have that applied to you. So there is a particular challenge which has a very big timing dimension in that sector. And then two final points. The first relating to correction orders. There is a pretty crazy number of correction orders. If you look at the percentage, I think it's 30 or 40% of orders get correction orders. And there is a way of avoiding that, which has existed, for a long time in the Transport and Works Act order regime, whereby the developer is provided with, on a without prejudice basis, the draft order and allowed to just make sort of technical comments on the drafting. And I think that would dramatically reduce the number of correction orders, and the uncertainty that a correction order can bring in terms of engagement post grant of the DCO would be reduced as a result. And then finally, I think that the amendment regime continues to be an issue in that, we, after 10 years or whatever it is, we've still now got for our very first material amendment. And that's pretty crazy. And the reason, as we all know, that's happened is because that process is deemed to be disproportionate. So all sorts of strategies are followed to try to reduce the likelihood that you would ever have to deal with the material amendment regime. And I think if that is addressed, to make that more proportionate, to give more flexibility as to how material amendments are dealt with, then I think that would play back into the application process, mean that developers don't put forward as wide a Rochdale envelope, and that would actually help and feed through. So those are my remarks. Back to you, Gideon. Thank
you, Julian, and thanks very much for picking up after the pause. We are basically back on time, ladies and gentlemen. I see we've got 127 people online. Please do put more of your questions into the Q&A. We've got about just around 20 minutes for questions and discussion. I've got a whole stack of things I'd love to talk about, but I'm going to ask you guys on the panel all about. But we do have, more importantly, some points from attendees, which I'd like to put to our speakers. So if Tom and Leo and Anna can sort of rejoin us. We've got Will Spencer has asked a question which I think kind of relates to some of the points you were making, Julian, which is, he says, I've worked on large highways project marginally below the NSIP threshold that went from draft to made Highways Act orders in about 2 months. Do you consider, therefore, the scope to reduce post-submission timescales for certain projects, e.g. where objections are limited? Is that the kind of one of the criterion, Julian, we should be looking at, or is it more about a general position about how controversial or how challenging the complexity is?
I can't see Will's question on the screen. I don't know if I'm supposed to be able to. I can't see anything.
It's in the Q&A, if you can see the Q&A chat, but I'll just read it one more time. Do you consider there is scope to reduce post-submission timescales for certain projects where objections are limited?
Yes, I think it's. I appreciate that if you were doing this fast track thing, you've got to make a judgment call in advance, and you may get surprised. And if you get surprised by the level of objections, then it may be that the planning inspector has to reconsider, and the inspector has to reconsider how it's dealt with. Clearly, the number of objections is a relevant factor, but inevitably the quality and the force of those objections is a factor as well. You know, occasionally, one shouldn't underestimate that point. And I think one of the good features of the regime, going back to something Leo said before, just standing back, is that compared to a public inquiry process, I think third parties get a hell of a lot more airtime in the DCO process than they ever do in public inquiries, where you get to the sort of third party section at the end of a normal public inquiry, and the sort of second class citizens get shuffled to the front to be patronized for half an hour. And it's not like that. Sorry, that may be too strong an observation, but it's not like that at all in the DCO process. So yes, I think that is a factor, the number of objections, and I think it's one of those things that it would be worth potentially trialing this approach.
Yes, thank you for that. And if I may add my observation, I do think there's mileage in what you're saying, Julian, about fast track approach in terms of the broad range of kinds of application. I dealt with one at the early stages of the regime, which I think did fall into that lowest category of smaller NSIP. It was a small railway. It was actually the first DCO to come into force, not the first one to be made, but the first one to come into force was slightly different. And that we dealt with that pretty quickly. We did conduct a 4-month only examination. That's the fastest at the time, and then some others came along later, did it also in 4 months. So this can be achieved. I think we did only have 1 round of questions, so there must be scope for some sort of fast track. Would Anna or Tom like to comment on this concept?
Very happy to sort of comment unless Anna's got something you would like to add first.
You can go first, Tom.
Thank you, Anna. I think it was for me really interesting to listen to sort of the logic and thought process around there. And what strikes me about Will's question is the learning from a different consent regime. And I know that sort of many people on the call will work across consent regimes and trying to think of the NSIP process designed for the types of projects that were originally set out in the Act. Julian, I think your characterisation of the three was also really helpful. So what would be really good to get through from anyone who sort of adds to the survey or sends sort of emails in is that experience of why other consent regimes might be quicker. Are they, you know, what can you read across into the NSIP process and vice versa, so that you look at infrastructure planning in the round, I think. So that would certainly help with our thinking as well.
Rob Gully's commented that he agrees with the points Julian's made, and like me, it's reminded him of the early railcord timescales. So that's in the chat. If you can put your questions in the Q&A, that would be ideal. But I can walk and chew gum at the same time on a good day. So I think I can look at both columns there. Also had a comment from Mark Woodger, and he says, completely agree with Julian on the scale of various NSIPs. The issue for ECC is resources across a wide range of NSIP topics. I'm guessing that is some sort of county council, possibly Essex. We are currently asked to consider 6 live NSIP proposals. A further 1 is in abeyance and 1 due in 2022, all of varying size, including 1 national significant, which alone would employ at 5 permanent staff. This puts huge strain on the available resources, results in seeking either divert staff or employ additional staff members. Planning performance agreements are therefore crucially important, as we were asked by Cabinet to cooperate at cost neutral basis. What are the panel's views on the roles of planning performance agreements? Authorities need to be funded to resource NSIPs, and this will increase if the process itself is increased. Anna, I'm going to come to you first. And anything you wish to add on the previous one, please do.
Sure, I'll answer this question first. I completely agree, and I'm supportive of planning performance agreements. I think it's a huge resource on local authorities and other stakeholders to get involved in the process. And I know, and talking to colleagues, obviously when the regime came in place prior to kind of 2008, obviously planning authorities were much better funded than they are now, and obviously one of the first to be cut. And I think if we're really looking at that kind of collaborative engagement to really get to the crux of the issues of these projects and the impact that they have, local authorities have a huge role to play, not only in infrastructure, and we need to give them the skills and the capabilities and the resources to engage with us. Without the engagement of these local authorities, we won't be going faster. So I think it's a real need at looking at this wider agenda, not just at promoters, applicants, consultants, and the legal teams. I think the key stakeholder really need to bring on board for this process is the local authorities and the statutory environmental bodies.
And I think, Anna, would you agree that, thinking of my experience on a project a couple of years ago, so much of what is done with local authorities prior to application is so important, because if an application comes in where the authority's been fully engaged and is engaged, and not saying everything has to be agreed down to the last letter, but if a lot can be agreed pre-application, if there's an understanding of the project in some detail, that can make a huge difference to the progress.
I think it can, yeah, and I think it ties up with looking at your statements of common ground. And I know commonly at the beginning of the regime, they were never normally submitted with an application version. They were normally upon request from the examining authority. I think really, how we can help structure that engagement and ensure that all the known issues are known. I don't think we'll always get to a case where local authorities and applicants fully agree. I think ultimately an examination is somewhat of a negotiation and compromise position with all parties. But I think using the statements of common ground is a key tool that's in existence and understood by quite a few people to really structure that engagement and support where we do get agreement, and what areas don't need to be rediscussed through the examination versus those that are the real crux of the issues of the conflict between promoters and local authorities and statutory environmental bodies.
Graham Gumby, hi Graham, comments that solar and gas are controversial as well in Suffolk. So it's not just offshore wind in Suffolk. I think Suffolk NSIP Central. I think that's what it's now called. A new name for Suffolk County. I've got a comment from Chris Atkins who introduces a point about. Well, I'll read it. Can any of the panelists shed light on the expected program review of NPSs? I think we did try and touch on that. I think he's asking particularly about or Chris with a K could be a she, about the National Networks NPS. I think we're all watching out for that with real interest. So Chris, we'll keep watching that. And I don't think that Tom was able to. I don't think he had the inside.
I don't mind speculating. I'm going to go with May next year on the basis that they're going to get a lot of responses. It's going to take a good 3 months to digest those and pull something together. I'm assuming there won't be a further consultation, and then they've got to find some parliamentary time and lay it and have, I think, a short debate. So I think May. I don't know, that may be still pushing it a bit, because I think when they said it was going to be the end of the year, when it was launched, I think everybody recognised that was ambitious. As soon as July was missed, that was clearly never going to happen. But on the other hand, they have pulled together, I think, a pretty substantial piece of work, in one level in an impressively short space of time. But they've also left out some policy areas that people were hoping would be dealt with either at all or in greater depth. So I think that's another feature. So that's just a pure, hopefully vaguely educated guess.
Thanks, Julian. And we'll take a sweepstake later on government announcements.
Can I just jump in on the PPA question?
Please do.
Just to say that we worked with a local authority on one of those mega projects over many years successfully with a PPA, and so they certainly can be extremely effective, but there are some local authorities out there that don't actually want them. I appreciate that I'm pretty sure it is Essex, is it, that Mark is with, is indicating that they do. I think one complicating factor is just to mention that National Highways, formerly Highways England, as a public body, don't feel that they can, whilst there are one or two examples of them agreeing PPAs, they don't feel that they can offer them as a matter of course. So I think there are some complications where there is public money on the promoter side, but broadly, our experience of PPAs is that they have been effective.
I'd like to pick up the point, one of the other points you made, Julian, and ask the other participants about it, which is the sort of policy challenge, offshore wind. I mean, my observation from some of the offshore wind projects I've worked on is that the regime is having to try and solve issues that wasn't expected of it at the beginning, and particularly the sort of what's the carrying capacity of the North Sea, what's the environmental carrying capacity of the North Sea, which each project anew is having to try and work out all of its own in terms of habitats regulations. And really, there is a case, is there not, for, I would suggest, the same level of policy drive that when one looks back to 2008, 2009, nuclear was a big priority for the government then, as it is still a priority now. And the department was willing to put in a lot of time and resources to de-risk the nuclear process, including identifying sites around the country, a huge amount of work. Isn't it time for that sort of level of work, policy work, to be done when it comes to offshore wind, which is our biggest generator of electricity after gas, after nuclear and gas? I mean, it seems to me that would be a good focus for government to spend time on. Julian, go for it, and then I'll ask Tom. And
well, I could speak to that for the next hour.
We'll book it in afterwards over a coffee.
But I suppose that the short point is that I think that realization is now appreciated across government, and DEFRA in particular now have a dedicated team and a load of funding for the next 2 to 3 years in relation to this. I certainly think that it's right, and I'm sure there are people on this webinar who have been directly involved in the difficulty that you identify of each project having to address this kind of broader issue, because all of the HRA issues on offshore wind have been on an in combination basis. None of them are on a project alone basis, and so that has been an issue. I mean, I think there's a combination of the role of the marine planning system, which doesn't really influence offshore wind site selection under the current model, and there's a whole data issue around knowledge about species, because there are now certain species that have been studied to death, and there are other species that are emerging as being sort of in the mix, who are now only starting to be studied more deeply, and so on. Plus there's the connectivity with other marine industries. So one of the constant bugbears of the offshore wind sector is that whilst it maintains a studiously cordial relationship with the fishing sector, the reality is that the impacts on birds in particular, and also on benthic habitats on the seabed from the fishing sector, dwarfs the impacts of the offshore wind sector. And yet, because offshore wind is coming along as the sort of relatively new sector, all of the attention gets placed on it rather than on the kind of baseline position in terms of the impacts from other sectors, fisheries in particular. So it's certainly true that I think there's a recognition within BEIS and DEFRA that there is a government responsibility here, and there's a current consultation. In fact, it closes this week by DEFRA on the best practice guidance for compensatory measures, which flags up a need for a strategic approach to compensatory measures, i.e. not just a project alone approach, in addition to sort of business as usual at the project alone level.
Thanks for that. I'm going to jump to a point made by Paul Bowen. I wonder what your views are on collaborative design with communities as a way to genuinely involve local people and build support. I've worked on 2 DCO NSIP projects where unfortunately collaborative engagement, charrettes, planning for real, were sadly absent. Can I bring in Tom or Leo to talk about that?
Thank you, Gideon, and Leo certainly join in as well. I think it's a really so interesting point from my point of view, because having sort of worked on so many different DCOs, there are so many aspects to a DCO, aren't there, that make them genuinely kind of either complex or for particular people, they'll have certain areas of real interest that might get lost in sort of the scale and complexity of a project sometimes. And I think this is where sort of picking up on some earlier points, kind of as well as some of the sort of points in the chat, what pre-application looks like and how you make it effective, and yes, we do want to see what improvements we can make there. Really does need to cover different topic areas and involve local people in ways that really sort of impact the examination. So I think my broad point from this reform point of view is actually to make sure that we do cover all of those topics that might not necessarily always get the headlines. And I think collaborative design with communities could well be one of those, and be interested to kind of hear some more of that evidence from various people to understand that more.
Certainly, I guess my 2 pennyworth on that is that, because I do some work as a design review expert, and my first training is as an architect, and I'm seeing NSIPs actually are increasingly looking at design. Questions are increasingly being asked about what the design principles and objectives were of the project when the promoter began the project, rather than somebody thinking halfway through the examination, oh my goodness, we're going to be asked what our objectives and design principles were, so we better write some quickly. And I do see a move in a positive direction, and actually more involvement for design review, for engagement with communities on, once the major development is permitted by the DCO. I know there are examples where the under the requirements, there is scope for, you know, some real community engagement on finalising some of the design, which I think is really encouraging. One question while I've got you, Tom, which is someone has said, isn't the planning inspectorate's increasing willingness to refuse applications at acceptance stage one of the problems? I read recently that there were as many withdrawals, refusals in the last year as there were in the 5 years before. That's an anonymous attendee. I suppose I'm tempted to feed back to that. Well, if you're a community objector to a scheme and you see that over 90% of DCOs are approved, then you might be looking hard at acceptances and expect a pretty tough, pretty high bar at that stage. But Tom, any response to that point that's been made?
Thank you, Gideon. I mean, I think the challenge for us here when we're looking at the process end to end is how all the stages interact with each other, and we've got a really, quite detailed legislative framework for those decisions that happen at each stage. And I think the work we've been doing sort of in the background since the National Infrastructure Strategy came out, which some of you may have seen in the letter that the Minister wrote ahead of the recent NIPA conference, looks at the statistics, and we are getting the evidence together, and we have been reviewing evidence behind those statistics, and we work really closely, obviously, with the planning inspector, as you would expect, as well as through this engagement, to understand, why are applications potentially not accepted or withdrawn, as well as why, when they go through, what advice is given by the planning inspectorate, and what impact does that have on timescales going forward. So we are really trying to look at this in the round. So sort of rather than speculate on a sort of specific stage, I think what I'd really encourage is, again, as part of sort of evidence gathering, different sort of experiences of those stages and how they interact with each other. So if we're going to get a number of projects going smoothly into examination and see shorter timescales, what has worked at pre-application to enable that, or what can we learn from those projects that may have to be withdrawn for whatever reason, and we can have different mechanisms for lessons learned in that. But that would be my sort of reflection. Gideon, could I just come back on the PPA point as well?
Yeah, please do. Right? Yeah, of course.
Thank you, and I'm mindful of time. Local authority play such a central sort of role in terms of the evidence that supports examining inspectors, as I know from my own experience, and the National Infrastructure Strategy highlights local authorities as one of those sort of key aspects that we're looking at. And I just want to bring Leo in, particularly on work we're doing with the Planning Advisory Service as well. But I just wanted to flag that that's something we're already talking to some local authorities about, but expanding that quite significantly.
Thanks, Tom. Excuse me. Yeah, I think our understanding as it is from what we've been told, and obviously our previous experience in the private sector, is PPAs often form a really important sort of cornerstone of engagement, but that's not to say there isn't room for improvement there, particularly around we've got a linear project where perhaps promoters having to enter into 6 different PPAs. Perhaps there's opportunities there to have something more centralized that encourages collaboration between local authorities. We're not sure yet. It's something we know. We are confident there's some improvements to be had there, but we're working with the Planning Advisory Service to really hear from local authorities about their experiences of PPAs, what works and what doesn't, and try and look at if there's some opportunity for sort of improved models of engagement there. But I definitely encourage anyone on this who has experience of PPAs from whatever angle, really keen to hear from you and understand what does work about them, and maybe perhaps also what doesn't, and what we might need to look at. Because I think they're often really positive, but that there's definitely more to be done there, we think, to sort of serve their purpose better.
Thanks, Theo. A couple more points. Dal Sweetland has said local engagement needs to be clear what can and can't change. I think that is absolutely the kind of foundation bedrock, isn't it, of good community engagement, which we talked about a moment ago. Carl Craddock has written in to say it would be helpful if the review took into account other sources of delay to not originate in the DCO process itself, particularly highlighting traffic modelling, which can be grindingly slow, etc. Interested in views on that. And also, Will Spencer has asked whether the panel think that the actual NSIP thresholds themselves are right, and should they be reviewed. I'm going to, and finally, James Moon has asked a point about the provision of NSIP trainings, technical consultees, should that be delivered centrally? Anna, would you like to pick up any of those? I'm going to go to you and then back to Tom or Leo, and then we're going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid, because we're slightly just on 11 o'clock. So Anna, any final points picking up any of those?
So I think regarding the existing NSIP thresholds, now they're about right. My general gut feel is they are, but I think an area that is growing within the industry is DCOs that have more than one NSIP in them. I think we're seeing an increasingly number of highway NSIPs, which are also incorporating a number of utility NSIPs and energy NSIPs due to the diversion. And that I know for on the Lower Thames Crossing, we've got the main highways NSIP, and then we've got 4 other utility NSIPs in there due to the diversion, and it doesn't cover the needs case. And I do think probably looking at how DCOs have evolved over time, they are getting bigger, they are getting more complex, and I think this is becoming a common thread that we didn't necessarily see in its inception. Whether there is some work that can be done around that to look at making sure that they are appropriately assessed and considered within the appropriate framework, but do we need to look at the thresholds slightly differently if it's the primary purpose of the infrastructure isn't necessarily resulting in many more NSIPs there? So I think there's definitely a piece of work that can be done around that.
Thank you. And Tom, any final brief point?
Thank you, Gideon. Firstly, I think just to pick up on the theme of Carl's point, but also what Julian was talking about in policy as well. For me, the question is what's playing out in examination and decisions that have their root causes elsewhere outside the system. That's a really important point, I think, for everyone to sort of bear in mind, and tracing that back, because I think we've got a bigger stakeholder sort of group to be working with that we're actively trying to sort of engage, particularly where there are strategic issues that can be sort of addressed elsewhere. And offshore wind's a really good example of the involvement of cross-departmental and cross-industry users, and looking at actually some quite really tough challenges there. So that would be my sort of reflection on some of those points. And finally, just to say thank you for having us along, and it's been really valuable from our point of view. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tom. And look, we've just scratched the surface, haven't we? Really, gosh, we've just begun to get interested, and I can see that we would have been able to be here for many minutes, many hours longer. There is an opportunity 1st and 2nd of March to join the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects Forum. It's a 2-day. You can have a 2-day extravaganza on NSIPs. For those of you who are fairly new to NSIPs and DCOs, I guess I'd call it how to do it. And for those who have experienced in DCOs and NSIPs, it's maybe about how we can do it better. So that's always gives us a bit more of an opportunity to get into the different aspects of DCOs and NSIPs, which we've only been able to touch on today. Thank you so much to the over 100 people who were online. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure the slides will be available. And thank you so much, everybody on our panel, Julian, Anna, Leo, and Tom. Great to see you, and a virtual round of applause. Okay, thank you very much. Bye all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Gideon.